Why take one vacation with the family when you could take all of them? With Royal Caribbean, you don't just go to the beach. You visit a private island and race down the tallest water slide in North America. You don't just go for a road trip. You ATV and zip line through the jungle. You don't just go somewhere new. You rappel down waterfalls and discover ancient temples. Because this isn't just any vacation. This is all the vacations. Come seek the Royal Caribbean. Ships Registry, Bahamas.
I'm Jason Palmer, one of the hosts of The Intelligence, The Economist's daily current affairs podcast. The Economist's award-winning shows make sense of what matters, from our special series on China's president to our weekly podcasts on business, technology, and American politics. Our journalists provide fair, in-depth reporting on the events shaping the world. To get the annual plan for less than $2.50 per month, search for Economist Podcasts Plus to start listening today.
Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. Kieran's one of our special pods. I mean, other people would have come up with a Valentine's Week special. No, why would we? We're not going to do that sort of thing. We come up with a really interesting interview. It behoves me, Kieran, to ask how you are. How was your Valentine's night? Well, you know, I know the answer because we spent it together.
Yes. Yes.
In a romantic hotel in Liverpool. Except that's where you were, and I was in Norbury, so it was even less romantic than it sounded. Our interview today, though, Kieran, Manchester is a city that you love very much. It's a city that you know a lot about. And Manchester City is a club you've seen many times back in the day. And this interview is with the former chairman of Manchester City, David Bernstein, who took over in 1998, was chairman for 5 years before selling out to Thaksin Shinawatra. And he has a book out on the 11th of March called We Were Really There, The Rebirth of Manchester City. And we spoke to him about the book. And sometimes, Kieran, I'm a little wary of doing an interview that is going to sound just like it's a plug for a book. But this interview was very far from that. It's a fascinating interview. And this is what David Bernstein had to say. David, thank you so much for joining us. Before we talk a little more about the book and about your time as Manchester City, just explain to our listeners about your life outside football and how you came to be a lifelong Man City fan.
Yeah, well, I was born in the north. I was born in St Helens, but left there when I was very, very young. But moving south when I was a kid and growing up down here, I had a great feel for the north and my northern roots and so on. And quite why I latched onto City as opposed to Liverpool, which is closer to St Helens, I'm not altogether sure. But I think a bit to do with the mystique of the stadium, Main Road being holding the record crowd for English club football of 84,000 odd. The sky blue shirts I loved and so on. But I became totally absorbed with City a long while ago, in about 1954. Just before the cup finals of 55 and 56. And I've been a sort of a huge fan ever since. I mean, my career basically is, I'm a chartered accountant. I was in practice for quite a period of time and then moved into business, and I've had a whole string of chairmanships of companies ranging from Ted Baker to French Connection to Vanarama to Carluccio's and so on. And when my football, involved with football, ran parallel with my business career for 20 years.
Yeah, we'll talk about the move away from Main Road later, because that was actually, as an away fan, it's quite a scary place to go, but it was a proper stadium. And before we talk about your time at Man City and what's happened since, just tell us how you came to be the chairman of Man City, because it was Francis Lee you replaced, wasn't it?
It was indeed. Well, yeah, that's very strange. I was joint chief executive of the Pentland Group. That's the Stephen Rubin's company that owned Reebok shoes at one stage and so on. And I moved from professional practice to Pentland, And when I joined, my role was really strategic and trying to find companies to bring into the group and so on, and also sorting out problems. And we had a guy living in the north who had provided a personal guarantee for something, and I was sort of chasing him, but got quite pally with him. And he was very involved with sport and football and so on. And he said, one day he said to me, I know you're a City fan. I know Mike Summerby very well. He knows Francis Lee, and Franny's looking to make us take over the club. And would you be interested in talking to him? So I thought, to talk to Franny Lee, of course I would. I'd be only too thrilled. So we set up a meeting. I met with him at a hotel in Manchester, and we got on very well. I gave him some advice. I wrote him quite a long letter, financial advice, which he didn't take up. He went ahead with doing what he did, and found very quickly he was undercapitalised and under financial stress very, very quickly. And we kept in touch, and he asked me to come on the board, which was, for me, as a lifelong fan, you can imagine, was a great privilege. So that's the way it started. It was an introduction that led to a meeting that, led to him inviting me onto the board.
And when you did take over from Francis Lee in 1998, what was the mood like around the club at that time? Was it purely survival, or was it, right, we have to wake this sleeping giant?
The mood was mutinous, dangerous, a bit vicious. Wow. The club was in absolute free fall, but all those things provided an opportunity. I never owned the club. I had an interest, but quite a small one. But because people were very scared, I think the fans were extremely upset at what was happening to the club. I was given carte blanche in a way by everybody, by the board, by the shareholders, to sort of get on with it, and it enabled me to really pursue a very radical course of change. And this is what the book is partly about. It's about changing an underperforming organisation, and starting the route, the journey that has led to where the club is now. So it was a difficult atmosphere, but I found that very stimulating, and I felt it was a fantastic opportunity, because there was quite a lot of low-hanging fruit, as well as dealing with a lot of things that people had found impossible before. But I was determined there'd be no sort of sacred cows, or everything was up for grabs.
And of course, we know about the finances of the current Man City club, but what were the finances like when you took over?
They were dreadful. It was very hand to mouth. We had no resources to speak of. The club's income was, if I remember correctly, when I got on board, was about £13 million, 13. That was everything. Wow. That was gate money, the whole lot. But at the time, if you remember, but first of all, Main Road, which I loved as a stadium, it was in a bit of dilapidated state. We didn't have a proper training ground. We didn't have a club store ready. We had a store the size of my dining room table. It was tiny. Frankly, the management of the club was in not good hands. I mean, the commercial management and so on. So one way or another, the club was really been left behind into the early 20th century. It was years out of date. And compared to Man United, of course, who were flourishing at the time, we were just eons behind them.
I was particularly intrigued about the decision you took straight away to renovate the boardroom and the photograph of the crying child. Tell us about those. Yeah,
well, I believe that making these sorts of changes, and I think frankly government can learn a bit about this. Some of the things you need to do need to be real and hard, and major sort of. But other things need to be symbolic. Symbolism counts for a lot, and I felt that a club boardroom was important. It has a mystique about it. I think the fans like to feel the club's being properly run, and the boardroom was where things happen and where big decisions are made. And also, frankly, when you entertain people at the ground, say the bank manager or anybody else, they came into your boardroom, and oh boy, whoever it was quite impressed to be in the boardroom of Manchester City. So we reinstated the boardroom, bought up a beautiful boardroom table that was languishing in a cellar somewhere. And when we got relegated, about 3 months after I became chairman, to the third level of English football, for the first time in our history, at Stoke City, where we actually won 5-2, but but got relegated. There was a young man, he must have been then about 13 or so, and he was caught on camera, head in his hands, crying his eyes out. And I got the original of that photo for the Manchester Evening News. I had it framed, put in the boardroom, and said to our board, this boy is never going to cry again like that. We are going to look after him, and we're going to look after the fans, and this is not going to happen again. And that was there right through my chairmanship. And he has never. I mean, he actually got in touch with me not long ago. He's now in his 30s, and he says he never forgot that day, and he's never cried about a football match since.
I know. I looked him up. His name is Leighton Cobbett.
Leighton Cobbett, absolutely.
Yes, and I believe he sent you a message for you. You had an important birthday recently. Yes,
I did.
Talking about that relegation to the what was Division 2 then, despite everything that City have achieved recently, I still know some fans, some older City fans, who will tell you that their favourite game was that playoff final against Gillingham.
Absolutely.
And I believe you're of a similar mind, because it was
absolutely.
an incredibly...
Without doubt, I would regard that as the most important game in the club's history, because we were working hard, we were doing the right things. That season has started, Joe Ward become manager, but it started quite poorly. We were sort of struggling a bit, and it was difficult to understand why. I felt we did the right things, we were building up a decent team, and it wasn't quite working. And at Christmas, we beat Stoke City, coming again from behind, and from then on, the whole momentum started to change, and we had a great run, but we were too far behind to go up automatically. Got to the playoff semi-finals, beat Wigan only just, and then played Gillingham in the final. And it was the most extraordinary match, as you will know, 2 down, approaching injury time, and yet we won it. Had we not won that game, I think the momentum and the credibility that we're beginning to develop would have fallen away. And one of the big implications possibly would have been that the support we had for the new stadium, including from Sport England and the Man City Council, it might have fallen away. They might have felt that we were just too far behind to be able to pull back. So no win with Gillingham, no new stadium, and if there's no new stadium, there's no Abu Dhabi investors coming in a few years later. So I think that game, I know there's other huge games, of course, including when we won the Premier League for the first time, but this was vital, and without this, the other stuff doesn't happen, I don't think.
I knew that Paul Dickoff had scored the equaliser, but my memory had obliterated the fact that Terry Hurlock used to play for Kevin Hurlock. Used to play for Man City. It's incredible to compare those two teams. Talking of that first time you won the Premier League, were you there for the Aguero moment?
No, I wasn't. I watched on television, but I wasn't there.
Well, let's talk about the stadium. We've talked a lot on the pod, David, about the West Ham deal with the London Stadium, because it agitates most of our listeners to a great degree.
Yes.
But your deal for the Etihad was pretty nifty, wasn't it? How did that deal come about? And was there anyone else interested in taking it?
It was, if I may say, it was very nifty, and I think we played a difficult hand really well. Basically, the Commonwealth Games was fixed to be in Manchester. The powers that be had a choice of a temporary stadium and probably a bit of a second-class event, or a really top-class permanent stadium. But if they're going to have that, they needed a long-term occupant, and frankly, there was nobody else. Rugby league clubs and whatever else could not possibly get the attendances that justify a stadium of that size. So we took a really, in a way, we didn't have a great hand to play, but we took a very tough line. And we said, look, yes, we're prepared to do this. In fact, we're very pleased to do this, but it's got to be a blue stadium. It's got to be fit for our fans. There'll be no athletics track afterwards. It can't be on one of those stadiums which sort of flips between athletics and football. It's got to be a specialist full-time football stadium. And we will not pay any. We argued, and it was accepted that Main Road gave us a 34,000 capacity, and therefore we should only pay a rental or whatever based upon attendances over 34,000. and we got that argument accepted. So we ended up with a wonderful new stadium. The total cost was, I think, of 150 million.
Yeah, 150
of which
million.
we only paid about 10 million ourselves. And the City Council or Sport England or whoever paid the rest. And we had a rental arrangement which, frankly, was extremely favourable, to the extent that we were playing away to Newcastle round about that time. And I went to their boardroom, and Sir John Hall came up to me, very aggrieved, and said, David, he said, there must be something funny going on in Manchester with this deal. I said, nothing funny at all, just good negotiation.
I'd like to bring Kieran in here briefly about the stadium, if you don't mind, David, because Kieran loves the city of Manchester and has spent a lot of his time there. But the stadium has been fantastic for the city, Kieran, hasn't it? I mean, it really helped regenerate and redevelop an area of economic hardship, Kieran, didn't it?
Yeah, East Manchester isn't in a great condition historically, and setting up the campus and being able to provide jobs, opportunities, education, health. If these things are important, it doesn't matter whether it was Manchester City or Manchester United, or Liverpool or Everton or whatever the club is. I think it does show that football can make a real positive impact socially, as well as the excitement that it gives to us as fans.
It's also, I have to say, it's a great place to go as a broadcaster. I loved doing Match of the Day too from there, because they were the friendliest. They had this wonderful press secretary called Rose, and the most brilliant, and the food was found. I remember going there with Ricky Hatton once. It was just the most astonishing thing.
Why take one vacation with the family when you could take all of them? With Royal Caribbean, you don't just go to the beach. You visit a private island and race down the tallest water slide in North America. You don't just go for a road trip. You ATV and zip line through the jungle. You don't just go somewhere new. You rappel down waterfalls and discover ancient temples. Because this isn't just any vacation. This is all the vacations. Come seek the Royal Caribbean. Ships Registry, Bahamas.
This episode is brought to you by Carnegie Mellon's Tepper School of Business. Want to advance your career or switch fields? An MBA from Carnegie Mellon's Tepper School of Business can help. Earn your degree from a top-ranked business school with a thought-provoking curriculum, one-on-one leadership coaching, support from experienced career counselors, and full-time, online hybrid, and accelerated MBA formats. Join the intelligent future. Visit cmu.edu/Tepper to learn more.
Before we talk about what's happened to Manchester City recently, David, in the press release for the book, and I didn't get the book in time to read the full book, but in the press release talks about Wimbledon and Glasgow Rangers being interested in Man City at one time. What were the circumstances of that?
Well, yes, there was a bit of, I suppose, opportunism. I think people saw that here was Manchester City struggling, a great club with a great history, but really in trouble. But it still had the fan base, and was fundamentally a great institution. In the case of Wimbledon, they sort of thought they could maybe work out I suppose, like a reverse takeover, where they would inject themselves into City. They were the Premier League at the time, so that City would get the Premier League status that they'd lost, albeit in a sort of a merged form. It wouldn't be the Man City that we knew. Anyway, I mean, I knew immediately this was a recipe for disaster, and I would be quite properly stoned if I ever even thought about it. So that got dismissed very quickly. The more serious approach was from David Murray at Rangers, who I think felt that they could take a stake, or I don't know whether it was to acquire the club completely or take a sizable stake, which I think, being in Scotland, they could do that within the rules. I wasn't keen on that either, really. Although we gave that, we had to felt duty bound to give it some consideration. I met with David Murray in Glasgow, but it fell away pretty quickly. And I think it fell away because we really felt we could turn this round ourselves. And what we did not want to do is dilute the club and dilute its history in any way at all. We wanted to keep it, pure and proper and as an independent club.
I'm a very proud Londoner, David, but I almost admire the optimism of somebody at Wimbledon going, I don't think Man City will mind if they get taken over by that. I think they'll be fine with that. We'll change the kit. We'll change the nickname.
There's a story that you talk about sort of people getting strange ideas. There's a story in the book. I'll tell you about briefly that we had a player. I think it was crumbs. It was. I forgot the player for a moment. Maybe Mark Kennedy. Anyway, we had an approach from Mark Goldberg at Crystal Palace. Mark had made a lot of money very quickly and
lost it just as quickly.
Lost it. You'll understand this story. So he asked, will I meet him in a hotel in London? I get to the hotel. He rolls up with his, I think it was his Rolls Royce, leaving it outside the hotel on a double yellow line. Comes in. Basically, the discussion goes like this. I say, look, he's a great player. I was looking to get about 600,000 for this player, and I say to Mark, I think he's a really good player, but we don't really want to sell him. But for 800,000, we'd do the deal. He bangs the table and said, "I'll give you $1 million." Now, I asked for 800,000. I'm expecting 600,000. But he gives me $1 million. Now, how can you explain that? You explain it only by ego and getting carried away. You wanted to show me what a great sort of, and it's a bit like Kevin Keegan used to say to me, the difference between you and me, Chairman, is I like to go through the front door. Meaning he'd like to slap a check on the table and don't fuck around. You like to go through the back door, you said, which I knew what he meant. Very different sort of approach. Anyway, people lose their heads in football. That's the point, I think.
Yeah, I'm a Palace fan, and what you just said explains quite a lot as to why we ended up in administration at the end of Mark. I mean, Mark Goldberg is he's a charming man. He's actually very interesting now, the way he talks about how he behaved at the time, but it doesn't surprise me at all. And talking of players and controversy about players, in the excitement of City's recent history and their new ownership, we tend to forget about the first overseas owner, which is, of course, the former Thai Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra.
Indeed.
Is it true that the ultimate cause of the sale to him was the Robbie Fowler transfer?
It was slightly more complicated than that. The reason for my leaving the club was I resigned for something that I absolutely adored. It was a lifetime highlight, but because of a number of things, of which the Robbie Fowler transfer was one, a scenario where my board had been absolutely together. We had a really tight, disciplined. I was very proud of what we'd done, but it began to fragment. Bit by bit, and the Robbie Fowler deal, which my view was, having seen his medical file, that he was unlikely ever to play to the level he'd played at before, and that we could have got him on a pay-by-play basis, but in the end, because of what Kevin wanted, and my directors in the end sided with Kevin, we paid quite a lot of money for him, and it didn't go very well. That led to my leaving the club. That and some other things. The result of that, and I was proved to be completely right, was the club began to be very overstretched again. The disciplines that we'd had began to disappear. And John Wall and David Makin, who'd been great backers, they'd been the people who provided most of the money, and had been great partners for a while. Their own company, JD Sports, wasn't doing well at the time, so they were under great pressure, and they got pushed into a sale. And the sale was to someone I thought was totally unsuitable. It was not a fit and proper person. I sort of played with trying to block the deal. I could have possibly bought Sky Television's holding in the city, about 10%, but in the end, I thought this is not the thing to do. I'll be perceived as like an aggrieved chairman, and I didn't want all that, so I didn't do anything, and it got into his hands. And in the end, he actually the various promises and things he'd made in the prospectus, none of them were actually followed through. And in the end, he made a very good turn on the club, selling it to the Abu Dhabi people, which that money should have been made by the original shareholders, which were the City fans. Among others, we had 2,000 fans who were shareholders, who in the end sold to Shinawatra at an undervalue. It got squeezed out, which I was really horrified about, but it was too late that I couldn't do anything about it.
Early on in the interview, David, you mentioned the amount of money Man City were making in 1998. What do you make of the finances of the Premier League now? Are they sustainable?
Well, I think the finances of the Premier League itself are probably sustainable, yes. But what's not sustainable is the rest of football is in. And what is happening. This is why we need a regulator. This is why I really hope that the regulator's mandate will include an overview on the financial side of the wider side of football. Is that this gap between the Premier League and the West is so huge that the stresses it's putting on clubs in the Championship and below are so great that it's almost impossible to have a healthy pyramid, let's call it. The top of the pyramid may be okay, but the foundations are very, very weak. And there's something here which is not really sustainable. So it's not so much the Premier League I'm concerned about, it's the rest of the game.
Well, we'll talk briefly about the independent regulator in a moment, if we can. So I realise we have time constraints. But talking of the pyramid, you were involved in a review of National League funding, weren't you? Just about which you were quite scathing. Do you think the problem is that this country simply isn't big enough to sustain 5.5 full-time leagues now?
Well, that's a good question. Do I think so? I think it probably. I think if there was a more sustainable model of financing between the Premier League and the rest of football, if, for example, we did away with parachute payments, if we had mandatory relegation clauses in players' contracts, because if you're a business, if you're a business and you're turning over £20 million a year, and your wages bill is £12 million, and then your income halves to £10 million, and your wages bill stays at £12 million, you're going to be in serious trouble. Applies to any business, and that's what's happening in football. So the sensible solution, to my mind, is that you have mandatory relegation clauses. So if a club goes down, the wages in players' contracts go down accordingly. That would enable you to scrap the parachute payment thing, which would enable you to have a much better model of distribution of funding throughout the game. So there's more to it than that, but there's 2 or 3 examples of things I think we could do, and I hope a regulator might influence in due course to make the rest of the game more sustainable. If that was the case, I don't necessarily think there are more clubs than need be, as long as the clubs cut their cloths, sensibly. A club only got £5 million of income. Well, it can't afford to have more than £2.5 billion or so of wages.
Yeah, you clearly sound as though you're a fan of the regulator. Tell us about the Manifesto Group, which was in part the reason we hopefully will be getting a regulator.
Well, I was very concerned about all this, and I spoke. I'm pretty close to David Davis. You remember David Davis, who was very involved with the Football Association, a really, really, really good bloke. And we decided that we needed to try and get across a group of people with non-political, but with people of influence. So we managed to get in the same group Helen Grant, who was ex-Conservative Sports Minister, and Gary Neville, who's certainly not a Conservative, with Andy Burnham and with Lord Mervyn King, ex-Governor of the Bank of England, together. And we produced this manifesto, which I'm very happy to send to you if you'd like to read it. Yep. It's a very succinct document. And that, I think, has got the ball rolling and led on to the final aid review and so on, and now is going to lead to this Act of Parliament, I hope. I do have a concern that the regulator's powers will not sufficiently include a sort of financial involvement we just talked about. Because I think that is absolutely crucial. If you don't get the financial side right, the rest won't be right. Can't be. And I think that's at the heart of all this. So we'll see what, this country seems to live on compromise to a very great extent. And sometimes, too much compromise can produce poor results. I'm hoping that won't be the case here.
Two more questions for you, David. I'm very much looking forward to reading the book properly. Did you enjoy writing it, or was there a sense when you were writing it, it's like, crikey, football has changed so much in such a short space of time, hasn't it?
No, I loved writing it, and I brought back a lot of wonderful memories. I had drawers full of papers. I kept everything. I got board minutes and heaven knows what that no one else had got access to. So I think the book has got a lot of very interesting original information in it. But I really enjoyed writing. I was helped by Tim Rich, who was really great and helped me a lot. He's a professional writer, which I'm not. But it brought back a lot of great memories. I think there's a really good story there, both with a lot of interesting sort of events and things that happened during that 5 years as chair, plus a bit of a lesson in changing an organisation that's failing. And I think it shows the need for radical thinking. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I think this country needs a bit of radical thinking in many areas. We're sort of compromising too much. We're not really looking at changing things sufficiently strong. I think we did that. I think Man City is a very good example of changing something that intrinsically was strong, always had wonderful fans, and valued the relationship with the fans enormously. When we used to talk on the board, I used to say, remember, we're Manchester City Football Club. Or what is a club? An association of people of common interests, a common purpose, who work together and respect each other and so on. And that's the way we try to run things.
You strike me on brief acquaintance as rather a modest man, David, so this might be a difficult question for you to answer this last one. Do you think you get enough credit for starting the club's transformation from what is described variously in the book as a 19th century business and a chaotic mess? So you were the start of bringing the club out of that. Do you think your name is mentioned enough when people talk about the change?
Enough, but I think people who were around at the time, and now, of course, this is 20 years ago. So it's people over 30 or over 35. I think a lot of City fans remember very clearly what happened in the situation. In fact, once the recovery started, the road up, the journey is always way often more exciting than when you actually arrive anywhere. For example, the Boris Becker story would tell you that when you get there, it can be very difficult. And I think people who were around at the time do remember it. I ever made a City fan of the right sort of age who was around. They are very very lovely and supportive and remembering things. But this book is addressed a bit to younger fans who won't remember those things and probably think, well, the recovery started with the Abu Dhabi takeover. And of course, the Abu Dhabi takeover has been fantastic and it's accelerated things. Without their money and support, this never would have happened. But it wouldn't have started without, I think, what we did. So, no, listen, I'm not looking. But I'm looking for. I've had plenty of dividends out of this and fun out of this, and it was a great privilege to have been involved.
Yeah, I always panic slightly when people say the Boris Becker story, and I was like, we may have to stop you there. Unfortunately, we do have to stop here, David. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you. Really enjoyed the insight and the information that you've given us.
Pleasure. And if you want to follow up at any time, I'm happy. But in fact, when you read the book, if you want to follow through again, I'm very happy to do so.
I think we would love to talk to you again and go into more detail about the Manifesto Group in particular. So,
okay.
Thank you very much, David. It's been a pleasure.
Great pleasure. Good to speak to you.
Kieran, normally I would say, well, let's talk about his view on parachute payments. Let's talk about David's view on mandatory relegation clauses. But the most interesting thing there, which I don't think either of us knew, was the fact that during his tenure as Man City chairman, before the rebirth of that club, both Wimbledon and Rangers of the Glasgow persuasion talked about potential mergers or buying large amounts of shares.
Yes, and I think in terms of Wimbledon, we were aware that Sam Hammam would quite happily take Wimbledon anywhere that had a bigger fan base. So you can sort of understand that because he tried it in Dublin and so on. The Rangers story was spectacular. I mean, okay, they're both known for light blue shirts, but that's about as far as it's gone. And could have this been a sort of reverse takeover to somehow allow Rangers to be playing in the Premier League or getting into English football? It really took me aback, but clearly it didn't get that far. But the more and more you do read about some of the issues taking place in the EFL in the late 90s here and the early 2000s, especially with the collapse of ITV Digital, I think it was very serious in terms of inviting Celtic and Rangers. But this particular story is one I've never been familiar with.
Also interesting as well, Kieran, I thought, and one of the stories is sort of fairly well rehearsed in that Paul Dickov arguably is responsible for what happened to City, because David was very honest and said the stadium deal probably wouldn't have happened if they weren't promoted. And is also honest enough to say that deal, basically, he out West Ham and West Ham. But also, what I found very interesting is he was slightly cagey about the circumstances in which he took over from Francis Lee, but was quite, well, not happy, but admitted that he was reluctant to sell the club to the person who finally did take it over, as in Tatsi Shinawatra. And as we said in the interview, I think with everything that's happened to Man City in recent years, it's too easy to forget that brief period at Tatsi Shinawatra, who did kind of start the huge investment process, didn't he?
He did until he ran out of money. Whereas what we've seen with Abu Dhabi United is, first of all, a huge injection of cash, but then a long-term plan. Shinawatra always seemed to be looking for an exit route as soon as he got to the club, and he enjoyed the trappings of fame that being associated with Manchester City brought, which we've not seen from the Abu Dhabi owners. They've kept a much lower profile.
Yeah. So that book, David Bernstein's book, We Were Really There, The Rebirth of Manchester City, a reference, of course, to the City fans in the early years with their posters and their songs, We're Not Really Here, is available on the 11th of March. As we said, I've looked at extracts from it. It's very good. Thank you to everyone who's donated to Pod via our Patreon page. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution to the Pod as well, that'd be very kind of you. It will get you access to our chat community and our regular quizzes, and you can do that by going to patreon.com, Price of Football. If you've got a question you'd like answered on our regular Monday show, then email us at questions@priceoffootball.com, and you can go to the same website if you'd like to buy our book or a Price of Football t-shirt. We will be back on Monday with questions. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Price of Football. The Price of Football.